the executive director of the Museum of Idaho, filling in for Kim Lee today, who is taking she was actually hoping to take a last camping trip this weekend, and I don't know how that's going, but we'll find out. She might walk in here all wet here pretty soon. But very happy to have you all here for Museum Club today. I know most of you, and it's wonderful to see you again, and it's nice to have some new faces here as well. I'm going to run down real quickly what we have for you today and coming up. First, I would just like to shout out to a couple of our other staff members here in the room. We have Camille Thomas, Chris Sheets, Ashley Pernew in the back, and here comes Lisa. And we are all here ready to help you with whatever you would like help with while you're here. We have some refreshments over there, of course, on the counter. Please do indulge in those, or else all our volunteers will do so, and they don't really need that. So, uh-oh. I didn't notice Corinne was here, one of our volunteers. So there are several things happening and coming up in the very near future right now that I want to hit on just real quickly. And actually, first, I should say just a quick reminder, if you haven't already, could you please silence your phones to try to minimize the interruptions during our presentation today. Of course, we are recording this on Zoom as well. We have an audience online who are joining us, and will be able to submit questions as well. So what we have coming up for you
soon. Has Ashley been on the team for a while?
A week from tomorrow, so September 29th is the at noon. We will open up tickets for our annual haunted history tours for members of the Museum of Idaho. This is a fun benefit for members because how we generally do it is we open up tickets for Haunted History Tour, which is our most in-demand program of the year. We sell 400 tickets each year, open the tickets at midnight, and they are generally gone before noon the next day. And so we want to give you museum members an opportunity to get in early if you would like to. So you can do that starting on our website on next Friday, the 29th at noon.
I brought my umbrella just in case.
Oh, okay, yeah. Providing instructions, and Camille's ready to help you with that as well. It's a lot of fun. If you haven't been before, it is a walking tour of
let's go. This is the
surprise buildings downtown. We hit the attics, the basements.
I don't know if I'm going to run
out. We're going to go into some of the incredible, fun, actual, well-researched stories from our city's sordid past. Some of which you heard 2 weeks ago here at Museum Club.
Just so cute.
And so that was a fun little preview for that. So September 29th and then October 1st at midnight, they will go open to the public as well, if you have friends that are holding out and not becoming members of the museum. Next Thursday, October 5th, the following Thursday, October 5th, will be our member preview day for our next new special exhibit, Under the Canopy: Animals of the Rainforest. This is a special exhibit that hopefully you've heard about before. I won't belabor it much now. Suffice it to say, there are several live rainforest animals as part of this exhibit, which is a fun element that we have never had in the museum before. And live animals, accredited, highly trained, highly ethical staff to handle them well. We've got up close and personal animal encounters available for you, shows, and you're going to learn a little something about our world's potentially most important and most endangered ecosystem at the same time. It's going to be a wonderful exhibit, and as members of the Museum of Idaho, if indeed you are, Thursday the 5th is your member preview day that you get to come in 2 days before it is open to the public and see it for yourself. Camille, what are the times on member day? 2 to 6. It'll be good. Very good. And if you want to, we can keep you here even longer because we also have our next museum club that day at, in fact, that exact same time here at 3 p.m. So you can come and you can see some animals and you can get some hand sanitizer and you can come in here and eat some cookies and listen to Architectural Ghosts, which is our next topic with Libby Cook, who is an architectural historian. We'll be speaking in this room 2 weeks from today. So next after that, the following day, Friday, October 6th, will be the VIP exhibit opening for Under the Canopy. Those of you on that list have received your invitations, and we look forward to seeing you. Those of you who may not have received invitations, we would love to talk to you about how you might be able to get yourselves on that list. It's through donations. That's how it works. And then Saturday, October 7th is opening day for the public of that wonderful exhibit. So we hope to see you all here at some point, if not multiple points there. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today, who in fact, many of you probably met here about a month ago as well. Marie Holmer is an archaeological technician in the Cultural Resource Management Office at INL. And I want to take just a second to talk about that office because it's an incredible resource that we have here in town, thanks to the Idaho National Laboratory, of wonderful stuff that you probably didn't know happens at INL. And they are wonderful partners of us working with us on our archaeological collections. And we talk to them all the time. They help provide us all sorts of cool, like radiological based technology that we don't have in our own building, and just a wonderful group of people. So Marie Holmer is one of them. She's worked in this office since 2014. Remit includes database development and cultural resource data management, historical research in the pre-INL period, suffice it to say, and work conducted under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. So educational background: after Marie finished her undergraduate bachelor's in geology and archaeology from the University of Birmingham in the UK, she earned a master's in forensic archaeology and crime scene investigation from the University of Bradford, also in the UK, before graduating from our own Idaho State University in 2015 with another master's in geographic information science. Prior to joining INL, Marie held positions in environmental chemistry and archaeological science, as well as working with the collections at the Idaho Museum of Natural History during her time there on campus at ISU. She began her work with INL as a GIS technician here in this Cultural Resource Management Office, and has done some incredible work in history, talking about the Arco Naval Proving Ground, the Carry Act irrigation and homesteading at INL, and there's more of that out there than you might expect for a desert. And in fact, our subject today, which is the Jeffrey and Goodale Cutoff of the Oregon Trail. And so without further ado, happy to turn the time over to Marie Holmer.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to start by saying thank you for having me back so soon. It's a pleasure to be here. I was just speaking with one of our audience members before we started and was saying that there is so much to talk about in trail history, and even in this very small part of trail history on the Jeffrey Goodale Cutoff. And so we're going to just dive into a portion of that today. I think I will start by carrying on by some of the groundwork that Jeff laid, and that the genesis of this research in the Cultural Resource Management Office is the Section 106 work we do under the National Historic Preservation Act. And a project came along, and it was in the area of part of the Jeffrey Goodale Cutoff at INL. And so that prompted our updated recording of the trail to the most recent trail standards, and a lot of research to put together what we call a historic context that helps us evaluate and manage resources like the Jeffrey Goodale Cutoff and others at INL. So I'm going to focus on the people who established the route, both of them, those who traveled the cutoff, and what became of the cutoff after that emigrant travel period. Okay, so naming a cutoff, a lot of maps here. I do love maps. A name of a cutoff can tell us so much about the history behind it. Cutoffs cast out from the main immigrant trails, forming a network, evolving and changing over time as immigrants seek out grass, water, fuel, and food. The destinations change, and faster routes are constantly sought. The cutoff we're talking about today is no different. The name has changed over time, even recently, and it may change again in the future as we learn more about its history and the people associated with it. Many may be familiar with the name Goodale's Cutoff. I think that's what most of our roadside signs look like. And the addition of the Jeffrey, or sometimes Jeffreys, is a reference to an earlier attempt to open the same route. So you can see on the left, let me just get here, this map dating to 1858 by Governor K. Warren. This was part of the recording that started to look for routes for a transcontinental railroad. And so you can see here, we've got Jeffrey's route here with the 3 buttes and what says Godin's River here, which is today what we know as the Big Lost River. And then you can see we get to the top right here. This is an 1863 map. This was a map of mining areas. We'll come back to this one later. And again, you can see the 3 buttes. And here we have Jeffers Road here, coming across north from, this is the main trail, the main Immigrant Road down here. And then finally, when we get to 1878, this is a Rand McNally map. And now we've moved on to Tim Goodwill's Cutoff, which would become Tim Goodale's. And so even, you know, in this time period when the trail was still being established, the name was changing over the course. So as the maps tell us the origins of the cutoff, these names, we can look into their personal histories and the 2 men who inspired this trail. Sorry? Sure, yes. Oh yeah, no worries. So yeah, so we've got Fort Hall here, and this is American Falls, obviously before the reservoir. And here's the 3 buttes on here, and this is Market Lake. Over here, again, Fort Hall, and this is the main Snake River with the tributaries coming in down here. And here's Fort Boise at the other end of the trail there. On this one, they kind of separated it out. So we've got Fort Hall here, and then there's an emigrant wagon route and Tim Goodwill's Cutoff and the 3 buttes. And this is an interesting one because around this time we did see a separation of the route, and we'll talk about that some more later on in the presentation. Yes. Oh, okay, got it. So for Jeffries, he sort of embodies a lot of the experiences that many people had while they were traveling on the cutoffs, on the emigrant trails. And while Tim Goodale will see bridges that gap between sort of what the West was and what it was becoming. Okay, so you can't have a cutoff without a trail. And so the place we're going to begin is the Oregon Trail itself. What you can see here in the green is the Oregon Trail as it's defined as a National Historic Trail. And this covers 2,310 miles and was established in 1978. And it represents Western immigration to the Willamette Valley in present-day Oregon between 1841 and 1848. And defining that terminus as 1848 for the National Historic Trail reflects the advent of the gold rush to California. And so then we see the development in sort of 1849 of the California Trail, which you'll see in orange. And the National Historic Trail that represents the California Trail is, as you can see, a much more complicated network of cutoffs and routes that developed over time. So that doesn't mean that 1849, when people started traveling to California during the gold rush, meant no one was traveling to Oregon. Far from it. Many families continued to travel to Oregon to settle and farm. And you can see that these were really 2 very integrated routes. And some people made choices as they traveled as to what their destination would be. But this isn't the whole story. The National Historic Trail represents a time period and its significance in history. And so there are more routes and cutoffs beyond the scope of the National Historic Trails. And even though this map doesn't include a more recent review in 2019, which added trail sections to the National Historic Network, the Jeffrey Goodale Cutoff was not included in that recommendation. And we'll find that this is to do with the time period that the Jeffrey Goodale Cutoff was utilized, and its significance in terms of the National Historic Preservation Act lies later. Okay, so why a land route to the Pacific? And if any of you were here for the talk I presented with my colleague Josh, you might have touched on a few of these points in terms of fur trapping. And so opening a trail to the Oregon country as it was then depended on a path across the Rockies. And so as explorers, trappers, and traders traced trails across the western frontier, they followed ancestral pathways of the indigenous peoples who'd been there for thousands of years before. So when we get to Wilson Price Hunt and the Astorians, you can see on our little timeline here, around 1811 to 1812, this is part of the fur trade, and you can see their blue line here on the map. This is the Astorian party, Winston Hunt going up to Oregon there. They would in part establish part of the route that would become the Oregon Trail through Idaho. And a year later, an American Fur Company expedition, this time led by Robert Stewart, would take a traditional pathway across the Wind River Mountains, and that would become South Pass on the Oregon Trail. When Captain Benjamin Bonneville demonstrated South Pass as a viable trail for westward migration when he crossed with wagons in 1830, the Oregon Trail was established. This is a time of transition from fur trading to immigrant travel, where mountain men and fur traders took up enterprises selling to immigrants, running cattle and sheep, and operating ferries along the trail routes. This included Tim Goodale. So early immigration on the trail followed the network of trading posts established during the fur trade and what will become part of the Immigrant Trail network. In Idaho, one such post was Fort Hall, you can see here. And so this was established by Nathaniel Wyeth in 1834 as a fur trading post. And this is the first year that immigrants crossed the trail. Famously, Dr. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, Reverend Henry and Eliza Spaulding, and William H. Gray. But on reaching Fort Hall, they abandoned their wagons and used carts for the remainder of the journey, as at that time, Idaho was not passable by wagon. The Bidwell-Bartleson party followed them across the route of the Oregon Trail in 1841 as its entirety, and that marks the beginning of that period of significance. And so they still abandoned their wagons at Fort Hall. It wasn't until we get closer to 1843 and the Great Migration, which saw the largest wagon train to date of 135 men, 130 women, and 610 children. So Fort Hall would become a key point on the trail in Idaho as immigrants set off across the Snake River Plain to another trading post, Fort Boise, both of which were run by the Hudson Bay Trading Company until 1856. And this was the final leg of the journey before the Oregon Territory. So the trip through Idaho was one of the most challenging of the trail. Timing the trip across the trail was incredibly important, and this meant leaving in the spring to provide enough grass for oxen and cattle, but arriving before winter set in. The result, unfortunately, was crossing the Snake River Plain in the heat of July and August. So John Jeffrey, the first name in our cutoff, he experienced this for himself when he traveled the trail with his family as a 15-year-old. He was born in Independence, Missouri, that starting point for the trail, and he and his family emigrated to the Oregon Territory in 1845, just 2 years after that Great Migration and the start of the significant numbers of people. So what about John Jeffrey? He's referred to with many variations in his name, and depending on the source you're looking at, depends on how his name is spelled. So his experience continued to be like that of many immigrants. After arriving in Oregon, as we said, in 1845, he traveled in 1849 as part of the Gold Rush to California with his father, Thomas, and his brother. Unfortunately, on their return trip to Oregon, the Oregon Territory, his father passed away, and according to affidavits from the time from Glenn Burnett and Thomas Turner, he was actually buried at sea. They traveled on the bark, Louisiana, but he never made it back. And so 3 years later, John Jeffrey was married to Mary Eleanor Birch, and they entered on an Oregon land donation claim in Yamahill County, which is southwest of present-day Portland. So you can see this over here this is the township and section range. And here is right on the western edge here is the Jeffries Field. This was drawn in 1852, the same year as the land donation. So you can see he already has a plowed field, and this little black square right here, that is the Jeffries home. And so the donation lands were established in an act of 27th of September in 1850 to encourage settlement and secure the territory for the United States. And it required 4 years of settlement and cultivation, but also required that settlers were prepared to fortify and defend the land, because this was not entirely a contested territory, but there was still a joint ownership with Great Britain at that time. And so anyone who arrived, ultimately, there were several acts, but ultimately everyone who arrived in the Oregon territory before 1855 was eligible to enter on these lands. And you could gain up to 640 acres, depending on your marital status and things like that. And so Jeffrey and many of his family members were included in this purchase. So the land entry files that go with these entries contain a wealth of information. And so we know that Jeffries left the Oregon territory several times to return to the United States, twice on business in 1852 for 2 months, and again in 1853 for 9 months. And so the business of the trails, it wasn't really a one-way trip for everybody. And people continued to move back and forth and seek their fortune, not just at the end of the trail, but along the trail too. And so the business of the trails, there was ample opportunity for individuals to find a living. And so emigrating west, including John Jeffries, published guides like the ones you can see here, Campbell's is one of them here, the Western Guide, were very, very popular on the trails. They gave information about distances between landmarks, where to find water and grass and fuel, where to camp, and which route to take for your destination. The earliest guide of sorts was the topographical map of the road from Missouri to Oregon, which this is the map you can see here in the back. And this map was based on John Freeman's journey across the trail in 1843. And the map had all the information the guides wanted to share, contained the basis for many guides for travelers. And so you can see here on your right, it covers the water, the grass, the road, the fuel, and this all describes this area from Fort Hall along the Snake River, or the part of the Columbia River as it was at the time. So another opportunity that the trail offered was operating ferries. There were several river crossings on the trail, and often multiple ferry locations were established, charging for people to cross. Others drove cattle and sheep to new and growing population centers across the trails. And after his own time in the goldfields of California, John Jeffries pursued all 3 of these enterprises, 2 of which took place on the cutoff we're talking about in Idaho today. But before Jeffries, there was actually a 3rd person we're going to talk about today. And so although Jeffries is credited with the first opening of the trail as a cutoff, he may not have been the first to use this route. One individual, this is Luzerne Humphrey, you can see here. He traveled west on the Oregon Trail, like so many, and left his wife Harriet and their 4 children in Ohio to make a success of himself. He participated in a lot of different enterprises, as many did, including mining, but his main ambition was to publish a guide for the trail, and he documented this ambition in his trail journey, keeping notes of distances and places, and wrote to Harriet of his plans, even instructions of finding a publisher and what this would cost. You can see this manuscript map was included in his documents. And so the red arrow you can see here is pointing to the main Oregon Trail south of the Snake River, so right here, which was the route that Humphrey traveled. And the route to the north labeled, you can see here in blue, says new road traveled by wagon 1st July, 1852. And so no diary accounts have been found to tell us the route was being traveled this early, nor do we have any indication who might have traveled the route at the time Humphrey reported it. But we do know that based on newspapers from the time, there was a scarcity of provisions and grass and much suffering and loss of stock on that main trail. There were 10,000 people traveling that year. And so the pressure on resources was significant. And so understandably, other routes were being sought that were less challenging, that offered the necessities of travel. So 2 years after this event, the first crossing as documented here, Jeffrey established a route and a ferry across the Snake River for the cutoff that this would become. So the route of the cutoff itself, you can see here the route that Humphrey depicted in his manuscript map, coming north here along the foothills after crossing over to where present-day INL is here, and this is Big Southern Butte right here. And so what's important to know about this map in particular is it represents the cumulative route over the history of the cutoff. You can see at the eastern end of the trail, there are multiple trail routes here. And this represents those multiple crossings that developed over time. And, you know, earlier on, the ferry crossings, and then later as bridges were built to cross the river over the Snake. So for Jeffries, the earliest route was the far western trail. Here you can see straight to Big Southern Butte, with a ferry between Fort Hall Trading Post and the mouth of the Blackfoot River. This first leg of the journey, I'm sure anyone who knows the landscape out there, was the most challenging part of the cutoff. There was no water after you left the Snake River to cross the desert and basalt plain until you got to Webb Springs on Big Southern Butte right here. The problem was that Webb Springs often wasn't enough for an entire wagon train to quench the thirst of all of their cattle and the people. And so oftentimes they had to go straight on from traveling to Webb Springs up here to the Big Lost River. And that's where we start to cross onto the INL section. And you can see part of our cutoff here on INL. The experience of traveling the cutoff was documented in journals of the time. And at the time of Jeffrey's opening, some of those journals talk about how people were handing out guides at the river crossing, promoting this new route. And Jeffrey as well upped the advertising campaign with letters to the editor. And you can see here this newspaper clipping, which was published in Oregon, talked about the crossing from across his route where 24 people successfully crossed the cutoff. And it said, in part, the first 19 wagons that came through the cutoff arrived here in Fort Boise 4 days in advance of those who descended the Snake River by the old route. Stock were in better condition than when they left at Fort Hall, and the immigrants had no sickness whatsoever. However, Winfield Scott Eby, who you can see here, was kept a detailed journey. He was the captain of his train and documented their trip along the Oregon Trail. They did take the Jeffries cutoff, but condemned the cutoff. And before taking it, they met Jeffrey on his return from Boise and described this meeting in August of 1854. So Winfield said, late in the afternoon, Mr. Jeffrey got in tired and worn out. He had walked across the desert and could scarcely stand when he reached the water. The day had been dry and hot, and he had almost suffocated for water. In spite of that, Eby and his train still crossed to Big Southern Butte, and when they reached the western end of the trail and rejoined with the main Oregon Trail, He wrote, "We all join in condemning the cutoff, except Mr. King, who persists that it is a good road, and as to distance, both routes being about 230 miles. Jeffries is the roughest, but has the best grass. Our cattle are a good deal used up." So the challenge of getting to Big Butte was perhaps too much for some, and no journal accounts have been found on the cutoff after 1854 until the second opening of the cutoff, which happened 8 years later. So those earliest immigrants we talked about on the trails often had guides lead them across. These were new routes being established, and later on, the use of those published guidebooks replaced those individual guides. During this early period, individuals drove the development of the trails and the cutoffs, but this would give way for a short time to federal road building. California had become a state shortly after the discovery of gold, and as a state called for secure travel across the territories in connection with the rest of the United States. The Fort Kearny, South Pass, and Honey Lake Road was the answer to this. Early in the development of this road, Tim Goodale, an established mountain man, was a guide for the road survey, but he left, unfortunately, after a confrontation with the original superintendent of the project, William McGraw. Frederick Landa, who you can see here, took over the survey for the federal road, and after opening in 1859, it would become known as the Landa Cutoff, joining up with the main trail at Idaho and Fort Hall. So you can see right at the top here, so it comes across from Wyoming, and then you come down to the Snake River. So Goodale would be again connected with the Landa Cutoff when he wrote an assessment of the route for a federal report on the project, including the statement, "Emigrants don't care how far they go around if they get plenty of grass and water every few miles." And so this is something that we can consider when we get to Goodale crossing the cutoff that would bear his name. But like so many other mountain men, the Landa Cutoff and his guiding was just one of many enterprises that he was documented in. He also ran one of several ferries on the Green River. He ran cattle to New Mexico with Kit Carson. And before the Landa Cutoff, he guided survey for construction of the Denver to Salt Lake Road. Much like the rush of gold to California had a huge impact on the trails, gold in Idaho did the same thing. So a year after opening of the Landa Cutoff, gold was discovered on the North Fork of the Clearwater, and in 1861, it was discovered in Florence in the Salmon River country. As in the past, the gold rush changed the destinations people were looking for, and a route to the mining areas in central Idaho was all of a sudden in demand. And it's around this time that Alonzo Leland published a guide to the new mining areas. And what followed in 1863 was this map. And so Alonzo Leland had entered in on a mining placer, and was a newspaper man. And so to him, I guess it made sense that he would publish a report and make a map and communicate this. And so we had the second opening of the Jeffrey Goodale Cutoff. In 1862, just a year before the map that Alonzo Leland made came out, Tim Goodale was in Colorado, and a group of miners looking to get to Florence asked him to guide them to these new mines, and he accepted. When he reached Fort Hall, he decided to take the route to Big Southern Butte and try and reach the mines to the north. He may have traveled this area as a mountain man, or may have been trying to avoid increasing conflict on the main trail south of the Snake River, or maybe he knew that immigrants cared about grass and water and didn't mind how long it took to get them. Whatever the reasons, he amassed a significant wagon train to cross the cutoff, was so much so that one account stated that it took 3 hours to get all of the wagons in and out of camp. So one young journalist, Nellie Slater, she was just a teenager at the time, had joined the Goodale train, and before heading across the cutoff, she noted, "'Tis 40 miles across the desert, without water and no road but what we would make." Whatever Jeffrey Goodale had tried to establish 8 years earlier was apparently not a well-established road, and so they had to reopen this route for the first time. You can see Nellie Slater here later in life. This is Nellie here, and her husband and her 4 children. And so not just a diary documenting this really significant moment in the establishment of the cutoff, which would become known for Goodale, she also documented some of the experiences that were pretty typical of people crossing at that time. And so she documents the passing of her father, who she was traveling with along with her brother. And she said, "This morning at 3:30, father breathed his last on earth. He was taken very bad in the night while crossing the desert and kept getting worse until he died. He did not talk, only to answer as he was spoken to, and he was in right mind until an hour before he died. The funeral was preached at 10:00 by Mr. Hockett, a preacher in the train. We buried him half a mile south of the creek, 4 rods west of the road, beneath an Indian canopy. He died on 26th of July, 1862, aged 53 years, 7 months, and 17 days. And so the point that she's describing at the Big Lost River is somewhere on the INL. The exact location is not confirmed, but like so many people, she was a teenager who now was without a parent. Following Goodale leading the train across the cutoff, although he didn't reach Florence, the route became established in Idaho. In 1864, a reported 40,000 immigrants were crossing the overland trails, and many accounts of travel this year on the cutoff. Harriet Lowry reached Council Bluffs in Iowa and commented in her journal large numbers of immigrant wagons, some going to the newly discovered Idaho gold mines, but mostly families on their way to Oregon and California. She would go on to take both the Lander Cutoff and the Jeffrey Goodale Cutoff on her way west. The challenge of crossing the desert from the Snake River to Big Southern Butte had not changed with the second opening, and the journal accounts continue to recall the lack of water, the heat, and the basalt terrain along the trail. For some people, like Julius Merrill here at the bottom, after they didn't find any water available for them at Webb Springs, they carried on to the Big Lost River, only to find at that first point the trail meets the river on INL, there was no water in the river, and they had to continue traveling without water for over a day until they could reach the point in the river where there was still water. So after that immigrant period, the mining is a driving factor in transportation across Idaho. And as a result, these challenges on traveling the cutoff needed to be addressed. So infrastructure was developed to support people and goods moving across the state, and the Jeffrey Goodale Cutoff was no exception. In 1878, the Utah and Northern Railroad reached Blackfoot. This would become the eastern hub for the mining districts in the Wood River and the Yankee Fork, and acting as a connector between the two was the cutoff. Around this time, James McTucker, who's a resident of Blackfoot, laid out an improved road from the river to Arco, and it's at this point we start seeing traffic diverging when you get to INL, where the old route would head north. Just get my bearings here. So here's the Lost River, Arco is up here, and this route here is the new Blackfoot Road, whereas before it's kind of off the map here, but the Goodale's Cutoff would turn towards the river for water. Now we're cutting past and not stopping at the Big Lost and heading straight to Arco past Big Southern Butte. So he was followed by Alexander Dupont, who you can see here, who constructed a road from Chalice to the Yankee Fork mining area. And this was a shift from emigrant travel to staging and freighting, although emigrants continued to use this cutoff. And so staging on the cutoff was also something of an enterprise for Toupons. He held the mail contract for the stage route from Blackfoot, and he established what he called a dinner station at the Big Southern Butte for stagecoaches to stop, to get food and water and rest along their journey. But he also created a stop for water between the Butte and the Snake River. You can see here Carriadale Strayhorn here in 1877. She described in her book 15,000 Miles by Stage, which she wrote about her journeys with her husband. He was in the railroad business and traveled a lot, and she accompanied him across the country. She stated the halfway station was called Root Hog because of its filthy condition. It was only halfway the first day's drive. And so Toupons had a system of transporting water from Big Southern Butte and the improved Webb Springs 16 miles back down to the Root Hog. In spite of this improvement to the route and the provision of water along the way, the journey was less than enjoyable. As you can see, the condition of the highway here in 1901. Carrie also talked about how driving this road, the carriage would be enveloped in dust and you could really breathe because of it. And so this was something that continued, and later on, unfortunately, maybe Carrie didn't think so, Root Hog would burn down, and Toupons would move on. He lost the mail contract to another company who took over delivery and stagecoaching. Eventually, George Washington Powell would take over the mail route, and he would divert the road at a reconstructed Root Hog, and it would cross INL at a different location and a different road to Arco. Once we reach 1901, however, the railroad to Mackay from Blackfoot is constructed, and we really see the drop-off in travel across these routes. Now the railroad is there, and so the Goodale's Cutoff, at least in that portion from Blackfoot to Arco, becomes a road that is just used locally for ranchers and people traveling to their homesteads. Okay, so I think it's, I like to just finish with like kind of a what happened after for these people. What did they do? For Jeffries, he had a very interesting life with a variety of enterprises pursued, including being a lawyer and several other opportunities. He was also accused of murder at least 3 times. He never seemed to be convicted, so we can make of that what we will. Luzerne Humphrey unfortunately did not make his fortune and did not publish his guide. He did return back to his wife and children, and they moved on to another home in the Midwest with family. Tim Goodale didn't make it to Florence, unfortunately. They did make it to a mining area in the Powder River area. After that, there's not much known about his pursuits, although it is thought that he sort of retired with some other mountain men in the Bitterroot Mountains area of Montana. For Alonzo Leland, unfortunately, he was too good of a promoter, and when he returned to Florence to claim his mining claim, somebody else had taken it. And so he returned to newspapers without his fortune. As for Alexander Toupons, he was a very successful businessman and immigrant from France, but he was also present at Golden Spike, the joining of the Transcontinental Railroad. So a neat little part of history to be part of there as well. So I will leave it there. Are there any questions?
I have a couple of questions. Once the Transcontinental Railroad was built, did people going to Oregon take the railway part way and then find a different way to get to Oregon? And when would you say covered wagons and all that stop using the Oregon Trail?
Good question. For the first one, I think there was certainly a variety, once people have roots and once we get the development of the connection of the short line from Salt Lake City up to Blackfoot, and then we get the, before that, I think people tended to stay on the trails. There were certainly people who we have journals of people who were traveling after that early 1860s period on Goodale Cutoff. And even though the new straighter road was established for staging, we still have immigrants taking the original route of the Goodale's Cutoff to the river. They still wanted to get away from the traffic, rest, take water from the river and things like that. And so we still see people traveling even Goodale's Cutoff later on after that establishment of staging. And so I think it was sort of an affordable way to travel still. You're packing everything you own and traveling west. And can you mind the second one? The question was when did people stop traveling on the? I think the establishment of a more sustained network was when we stopped seeing the immigrant travel as it had originally started. And we also get to the point where, in terms of Oregon donation lands and the Homesteading Act, we've got a lot of people already settled in these locations. And so people are still traveling to mines, but we start seeing, Idaho was a thoroughfare. It was a place to get across, to get to your destination. But then later on, once we have mining established, we see Boise City growing as a support hub for the mines in the Boise Basin. And here at the eastern end, we see Blackfoot sort of taking on that role. And with the Homestead Act from 1862, we start to see people settle and farm and establish local commerce here. And so Idaho kind of becomes a destination. I think I'm trying to remember. Let me go back to my map here. See if I can. It comes out before. Oh, sorry. Thank you for reminding me. For everyone who's listening at home, the question was, what is the route of the cutoff, and does it come out at Mountain Home? So I'm just going to flick back through here. So you can see there's Castle Rocks here, and so we're not quite at Mountain Home. We're Ditto Creek Stage Station is where we join back up with the original Oregon Trail right there. So.
So the Goodale's Cutoff sign that you see while you are driving on your way to Cary. Why is that sign placed at exactly that location? How is that area, that specific area, important?
I'm not sure I can speak to Cary specifically, but in terms of the travel routes, they're approximating as close as they can with the driving routes that we have as to where those signs are, roughly following, the route of the cutoff. In terms of Cary, I'm not sure specifically what they might be signposting in terms of an event or the trail itself, but we roughly follow, I think, on the driving trails where the train goes to the best of our ability with our current transportation network. But those highways, follow, roughly that original route. And from Boise Basin, the toll roads that went to the Boise City, they incorporated parts of the original trail. And so, and it's the same thing like around Craters. There aren't many, routes, in certain locations. And so sometimes our roads are pretty close present day to that early establishment of that corridor. And I think I spoke a little bit about the National Historic Preservation Act and although Goodale's Cutoff isn't recognized as part of the National Historic Trail for the Oregon Trail, it is eligible under the National Historic Preservation Act. And I think that's a lot to do with not just immigration. It is part of that immigration to Oregon, but also I think it's really significant in that establishing Idaho in that run up to statehood. Bringing people were coming in, starting to establish these mining towns and everything that followed from there. It's still a very important route for Idaho, and the National Historic Preservation Act can recognize that. Thank you. Oh, sorry, this is Zoom one.
So a Zoom audience member asked, how much time did the cutoff save?
Based on what we know from journals, probably none. It was initially the temptation of this is maybe a safer route because there was growing conflict on the trail, the original trail. There's, once you did get past the trials and tribulations of getting to Big Southern Butte and the Big Lost River, there were a lot of mountain streams, coming out of central Idaho. There was grass that, nobody had, been relying on for, travel from, the early 1840s. And then, once the destination changed and people wanted to get to central Idaho, then, that was much preferable than heading all the way to Boise and then trying to head back into central Idaho. So really, it was only when the destination changed and people wanted to get into central Idaho that it really became a time advantage. Prior to that, Jeffrey was trying to sell a route that was grass and water, but not a time saver as far as we could tell. Thank you. Thank you very much.